welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron is up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I'm bringing Between the Fires in Los Angeles and Fascism in America by Robin D.G. Kelley. It was published in the latest edition of Hammer and Hope. And it's a beautiful blend of things.
Yeah.
Early in the article, it's reporting on the devastation of the Eaton fires and what happened to so many homes in Altadena. It's also a personal reflection on Dr. Kelley's years spent in Altadena as a young person. It's a history of the way that Altadena came to be, despite and maybe because of white supremacy operating in government vigilante groups and among neighbors there.
Yes.
And it's got a theme of resistance to the parasitic disaster capitalism that developers are using as an opportunity to turn Altadena into some new version of Beverly Hills or some other fancy upper crust wealthy place in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm so glad that I picked this one to read. It's so good. It's got a couple of moments in the first couple of paragraphs that I want to share before we get started and really get into it. But the first is, quote, "The burned out cars, twisted and discolored metal, thick toxic ash, lone chimneys and concrete porches, trees charred beyond the point of regeneration, appeared to extend as far as the eye could see." It's just powerful imagery that put me right there on the street with him as he was checking out the old neighborhood. And then the next moment that I wanted to share was, quote, "On the morning of January 8th, I captured the sheer immensity of the Eaton fire. The eastern horizon glowing bright red and orange against a backdrop of dark clouds. It struck me as a terrifying metaphor for the political conflagration that awaited us." And I remember having that same ominous feeling in January.
Yes.
The oncoming Trump administration and what they would do to implement Project 2025, the ongoing genocide in Palestine, the ways that so many environmental disasters are happening so frequently.
Yes.
It's overwhelming, and it gives the sense to me that this was a literal fire that looked like a disaster movie.
Yes.
Amidst so many things that are metaphorically on fire across the world.
Yeah.
So I want to share those two moments because I read both of them and they both stopped me as I was getting started reading this article in preparation for today. But what about you? Where do you want to start?
No, I agree. It's a really beautiful piece, and he is such an incredible writer. And so what an honor to get to continue to learn from Dr. Kelley. And for me in this piece, it was really great to learn more about the history of Altadena and the surrounding places to it, like Pasadena and LA and even California at large, not just from his perspective, but also from the perspective of the impact of things like anti-DEI laws in the state and property tax legislation in the 70s that also had a tremendous impact on infrastructure and municipal funding throughout the state. Things like the displacement of Black homeowners because of greedy developers and housing discrimination laws. I mean, the list really goes on and on. He fills this piece with so much incredible history and analysis and the connections of those things to the impact of the wildfires and really more specifically like the compounding impact of all of that on the experience of folks in Altadena with the fires. And so part of Dr. Kelley's analysis that really stood out to me because I remember it so vividly when these fires first started was how Trump and his cronies talked about the fires and spun this ridiculous rhetoric about DEI instead of focusing on the impact of the fires and the real sort of human beings, dealing with that fire. So Dr. Kelley said, quote, "Even before the inauguration, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and the MAGA crew blamed DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, for the California fires. They circulated screenshots of the Los Angeles Fire Department's Racial Equity Action Plan, accusing it of prioritizing, quote, DEI over saving lives and homes, end quote. They derided Chief Kristen Crowley, the first woman and first openly queer person to lead the LAFD as a DEI hire, and spewed racist and sexist vitriol at Karen Bass, Los Angeles' first female and second Black mayor, falsely claiming she shuttled funds from the fire budget to DEI initiatives. Ridiculous claims, but dangerous nonetheless. Anti-DEIA laws are smokescreen to criminalize anti-racism in any effort to protect the rights of women, gender nonconforming, and trans people, and people with disabilities, and to legalize racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. And so then just a few lines later, I think Dr. Kelley summed up my thoughts on this pretty well and just perfectly. He said, quote, "The response to the Southern California fires demonstrates the absurdity of MAGA's post-racial fantasies," which, is just 100% true and accurate. And I just remember being so flabbergasted by Trump and his posse and the way that they were talking about and focusing on DEI rather than, again, the fact that California was literally on fire and people were losing their homes left and right. And but that has certainly been kind of par for the course since then, right?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that he says here that also stopped me was the ridiculous claims, and but dangerous nonetheless. And I think those things for me aren't mutually exclusive. Right. They are dangerous because they are ridiculous.
Absolutely.
And they're making the claims because they're ridiculous.
Yes.
And they want it to be dangerous. They want there to be some kind of backlash against that.
Absolutely.
And we see some of that in how things happened in the 60s and the 70s, which I'm sure we'll get into with vigilante violence in response to people owning homes in Altadena. But so there's a lot there. And there are a few important points here that Dr. Kelley makes about insurance.
Yes.
And the first is about how policies are being canceled due to deregulation. He says, quote, "Many Altadenans had their homeowners insurance canceled before the fire on account of their proximity to wildfire zones, triggering a scramble for new policies. Now they are facing skyrocketing premiums and woefully stingy claims settlements." So this is something that seems to be happening in places across the country.
Yes.
I've heard that Floridians are having their home insurance canceled due to the threat of hurricanes.
Right.
And now we have heard of these policies in Altadena being canceled due to the threat of wildfire.
Yeah.
And I think that makes this next point hit home even more. Dr. Kelley says, quote, "Following the Project 2025 playbook, the administration had planned to gut the Environmental Protection Agency and FEMA. It has already begun blocking reimbursements for disaster recovery costs in some states and withdrawn funds for projects aimed at reducing damage caused by climate change. To be clear, the point of abolishing FEMA is less about the devolution of the administrative state than enriching private insurance companies by eliminating government-funded disaster relief." So if you put these things together, the policies will be canceled unless you can afford astronomical premiums.
Right.
And then because the insurance companies have been deregulated and they can choose what they want to do more freely, and there won't be public support for you in the midst of a disaster or following a disaster, and there won't be any effort federally to mitigate climate change disasters and try to do some prevention work around these kinds of things. So, that's a lot of fun knowledge. Putting those pieces together.
It really is.
A lot of good stuff there from Project 2025.
Yeah, the gift that keeps on giving. I was struck by all of that, and particularly I appreciate the analysis and the connection to Florida and other places. But the piece that he talks about around the point of abolishing FEMA is, really about allowing these private insurance companies to make big bucks. The other thing that it is it's just pure evil. I mean, when you think about those disasters and the ways in which, the federal government helps states respond to those things. I mean, that help is so necessary in those moments when people are, like in this situation, have lost their homes, have lost all of their earthly belongings, have lost family members. And it's really just pure evil to do away with that for profit. So there's a lot in that really just infuriated me to no less. And speaking of that, another thing that sort of infuriated me was really fascinating to learn about the timeline in which residents were notified about the fires and issued evacuation warnings in particular, because I hadn't heard this piece. I've heard a lot about the fires, but I hadn't heard this piece, and I was simultaneously incensed by it, but also not surprised, if that makes sense, Aaron, because racism. So Dr. Kelley shares this, quote, "Despite the eruption of 14 different conflagrations across 2 counties, the story of the 2025 Southern California wildfires is really a tale of 2 cities. To the west, the Pacific Palisades, a world of celebrities and a few billionaires with means to hire private firefighters to protect their own homes as surrounding properties burned. And to the east, Altadena, a largely working and middle-class multiracial community with a historic legacy of Black homeownership. Thanks to recent reporting by the Washington Post, we now know that the Eaton fire was first reported around 6 p.m. on January 7th. Warnings and evacuation orders were issued an hour later, but only to residents east of Lake Avenue, living in a predominantly white and affluent section of Altadena. By 11 p.m., fires were reported in the largely middle-class multiracial neighborhoods west of the lake. Authorities knew, but did not issue warnings or evacuation orders to West Altadena residents until 3:25 a.m. and again at 5:42 a.m. The Eaton fire killed 17 people, 10 of them Black. All lived west of the lake. More than 9,400 structures were destroyed. Although African Americans account for just 18% of the city's population, 48% of Black-owned homes were destroyed or damaged, compared to 37% of homes owned by non-Black people. And so, again, it's racism at its best, right? It's a tale as old as time, and I shouldn't be surprised by it at all. But it's the stories like these that I think people need to know about and need to hear and need to understand that this stuff happens all the time, right? And, it made me think about our, when I was reading this, it made me think about our, what's the name of the document? Eyes on the Prize, and what we learned about Philadelphia and what we learned about New York. I mean, the ways in which communities of color are treated and thought about, and in this case, treated as second-class citizens. It's really a lesson on understanding the deep-seated impact of racism and white supremacy in our lives, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I listened to an episode of All My Relations podcast, and they went to Altadena and explored how people are recovering from the fires. And this was a story that I heard directly from the people who made it out.
Yep.
Because obviously they were talking on the podcast.
Right.
But they said that they were notified at 4 a.m. or something.
Yeah.
And then they were out of their house by 5, and the house was gone by 6.
Yeah.
And so that has obviously stuck with me from listening to that podcast. And so, I encourage people to go listen to that too.
Absolutely.
Because hearing it directly from somebody who was being interviewed because they're involved in supporting the community. That's where they were found by their reporter, who was part of the team for that podcast, and they shared that as part of their story of what they had experienced.
Yeah, that would be worth listening to for sure. I probably would cry. I'm glad I read about it first so I could be prepared. I probably would cry hearing it directly from the person.
Yeah. One of the most powerful parts of this article is when Dr. Kelley is writing about the resistance to the parasitic developers.
Yes.
And so he says, quote, "Signs declaring Altadena is not for sale are everywhere, aimed primarily at unscrupulous developers and private equity firms like BlackRock looking to turn Altadena into the Beverly Hills of East Los Angeles. With land parcels selling above the asking price, investors are paying $69 a square foot or more for lots that averaged $22 a square foot a year earlier. The incentive to sell is high, but the signs remain, along with a determination to rebuild. Altadena Strong, a loose coalition of residents, activists, and architects, and established organizations like Dignity and Power Now are pushing for an equitable and sustainable rebuilding of the community. They want land trusts to keep developers at bay, strong zoning regulations to maintain Altadena's original character, and protections against displacing longtime Black homeowners. Black activists have helped families raise money and launched a Displaced Black Families GoFundMe directory to help residents recover and ideally hold on to their property. So I think this kind of recognition of how the disaster is being leveraged for long-term gain by developers is so important, as it's been happening for decades now. It's, this isn't when it started,
right? But
I remember it happening after Katrina.
Yes.
And what that looks like in New Orleans now and other places in the Gulf Coast is completely different than what it looked like before the storm in 2005. Right. And so having this analysis and being able to find ways to resist is great. And I'm really hoping that this can be a model for how other communities can resist this disaster capitalism in the future when the climate crisis comes to town.
Yeah, I think that's the big point of this, and the big takeaway for me is the picture of resistance and the beauty in that resistance that they're putting up. And I also love that he named these unscrupulous developers by name. Like, I was like, yes, put it on the paper. I love it. Another wild piece of history that Dr. Kelley shared in this piece was about racism and housing discrimination in Altadena and Pasadena. And I have to tell you, this hit home for me, and I'm excited to share why this hit home for me. So Dr. Kelley said, quote, during the 1930s and 40s, the Great Northern Improvement Association, another housing association, informed real estate agents and potential home buyers, quote, we want our section of Pasadena and Altadena to be a place for white people only, end quote. For the small sum of $5, homeowners could attach a racially restrictive covenant to their deeds and become members of the Altadena Property Owners League. By the start of World War II, 80% of homes in Altadena had restrictive covenants, and most of these remained even after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled such covenants unconstitutional. Some white residents turned to terror in order to keep Altadena white. In 1956, when word got out about the Reverend James Fashri Cherie, a white minister, planned to sell his home to a black couple, neighbors set his gas meter on fire. By 1960, Altadena was 95% white. Black people accounted for 4% of the population, and most of them resided in a canyon situated on the far west side of Altadena, known as the Meadows. And then a little bit later on, he says, quote, white resistance to black neighbors was not unique to Altadena. Throughout Los Angeles County, black efforts to move into white neighborhoods were met with vandalism, cross burnings, bombings, arson, and death threats. During the late 1950s and early 60s, cities and towns we now think of as black or multiracial, including Inglewood, Hawthorne, Gardena, Compton, Linwood, Southgate, and Leimert Park, came to resemble Birmingham, Alabama. In fact, on September 20th, 1963, just 5 days after white terrorists bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 black girls, the California State Legislature passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, prohibiting racial discrimination in the rental and real estate market. 14 months later, voters overwhelmingly backed a ballot proposal rescinding the law. It took the California Supreme Court to restore fair housing laws after ruling the repeal unconstitutional. And so there's a lot to unpack there. Like, not only is this racism and housing discrimination, like I mentioned earlier, but we also see that some rather common features of white supremacy at play here. Yeah. White terror and ignorance and violence and that mob justice and just plain hatred of black people. And I think the compounding impact of decades of that housing discrimination and racism and white supremacy has on a place like Altadena and black communities living there was and is truly profound. One of the things that is so crazy about this is I was on a call with my family last night, and we just happened, I don't even know how this happened, but we were talking about all places that we've lived. And my dad just out of the blue said, oh yeah, it was written in our housing contract that the person who sold their house to us couldn't sell it to a black person. And I was like, what? Wait, I need you to pause, because in all my life, I've never heard this story. Yeah. And the person that my parents brought our house from, our first house from, was someone that my dad worked with and knew was a white person, and called my dad and said, just so you know, like, we've accepted your offer, but I want you to know that this is written into the contract. And I told them, and she cursed, so I won't curse here, but, F off, right? Yeah. I'm going to sell to this family. And so I was like, I just never had heard that. So I think these covenants, I had a sense that they are everywhere. We're operating in lots of places, but this really, truly hit home for me in a way that I just learned about last night. So crazy.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if each of our houses have some history to them. Particularly looking at some of the maps of where racial covenants were happening.
Yes.
And so
that's crazy.
Yes. And I also want to say $5 is all you needed to join this little whites only group and get a racial covenant on a property. Yeah. That's what?
Yes.
And I know that these aren't enforceable by law anymore, right? Obviously. Yes. But with the way the Supreme Court is overturning long-held precedents, we should probably collectively think about how we remove these covenants officially so they cannot be enforceable because they're not there anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can't rely on the Supreme Court to continue to hold up precedent.
Absolutely.
anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah, back in the day, we were talking about this with my family, was that those covenants weren't enforceable, so it really didn't matter. But one of the other things that was sort of unique, and I had to sort of sit and think about this, was, we moved into our street was every person on our street was white. Every family was white. And so, my dad recalled just the looks that we got when we moved in. And I was so young, I don't really remember that. And over the years, many of those folks became, were great people, and they were wonderful neighbors, and we had a good experience living there overall. We never had an issue, at least that I know of. Or if we did, my parents did not tell me about that and kept that from me, which, good parents, great parents. But for him, it was like, it made a lot of sense, because I think that racial covenant was written into all of their housing contracts. And so they were like, how did y'all get here? Wait a minute. Yeah. So this stuff is real, which is wild.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's shift here. Let's talk about application.
Yes.
How does this connect to our lives and work beyond how we've already started talking about it? My application comes from that last paragraph of this article.
Okay.
It says, quote, "The promise of Altadena then and now explains why so many families held onto their property or passed it on to their children and grandchildren. They never intended to renovate and flip their houses for a profit in order to move to a better neighborhood. They stayed because of something much bigger than generational wealth: community, memory, and joy. Why they stayed and choose to remain made me think more deeply about what it means to hold on to a place in the face of colossal destruction, to return home to rubble. Beneath the rubble is land. The land is sacred. It is where our ancestors dwell. It holds all our memories close. It is the source of life and renewal." And so community, memory, joy.
Yes.
And that's something I think way more valuable than just money. When we talk about generational wealth, that's bigger than a bank account.
Yes.
And it grounds us in the land, this thinking, and what the land actually means to us, and centers a relationship to land that we don't often have in the West, in U.S. culture. And so I think we all need to live a little bit more like this, myself included. So that's my application. What about you?
I love that. I think my application is really connected to that. It's visionary. I felt really inspired by this piece, and I think this is one of Dr. Kelley's biggest takeaways from this piece, and that is the beauty of the hope and the inspiration that he's drawing from the work being done to rebuild Altadena in the aftermath of these wildfires, and to return it to its long time status as a thriving multiracial community. It's part of this vision for Altadena that he refers to throughout the piece. And at one point, he actually calls it a vision of regeneration in Altadena. And he just did such a beautiful job in this article to highlight how the Black community boomed and thrived in the 70s and 80s after the passage of the 68 Fair Housing Act and the 1970 federal court order to desegregate Pasadena schools, and what all of that meant for years to come in and around Altadena for Black people and the Black community to become rich in all of the ways that truly matter. And that connects to what you were just talking about there. And Dr. Kelley draws some real inspiration from some of the parallel hope and community building and fight that's happening right now as a powerful way to restore that beauty and that richness for the communities of Altadena, and particularly for Black people, and as a way to stand up against the political challenges that we face right now. And so all of that was just so beautiful to read about, to see real examples of, he's talking about real people in the community and the work that they're doing, and the connection to just the land and the beauty and education and this fight. And it was really beautiful to read about.
Yeah, it's a great application. All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today? This reminded me how much I appreciate Robin D.G. Kelley's writing.
Yes.
So I want to come back to one of his books this year. So I'm not sure which one, but let's read something of his sometime soon.
Absolutely.
So that's my homework. What about you?
I love that. I'll co-sign that. My homework is for us just to keep reading this latest issue of Hammer and Hope, because the first 2 articles that we've read now have been incredible. And so I think it is absolutely worth reading the rest of them. And I even want to go back to some of the previous issues because I know I've missed some things. And so I want to make sure I didn't miss anything world changing. So that's assignment number 1. I also want to read some of Dr. Kelley's recent pieces that he wrote for the Boston Review. He wrote a couple of pieces, this was last year, on higher education's response to protests, as well as one on the current political climate and how we should fight Trumpism. And reading this piece reminded me of those pieces. I remember sort of like bookmarking them and then, totally got away from them. So I want to go back to read those. And they're a year old at this point, but, I'll see if either of them are worth bringing to the table.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today. And Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. Well, it's time. It is time for our June book to come to the table. So that's what I'm bringing. The book is called Reconsidering Reparations: Why Climate Justice and Constructive Politics Are Needed in the Wake of Slavery and Colonialism. It was written by the great Olufemi Taiwo, who we actually had an opportunity to hear speak at an event in DC a while back, right? Shout out to that Solidarity Book Talk. And we also read his book, Elite Capture, way back in 2022, Aaron. I had to look that up and I was like, it's been that long? So excited to be reading his book right now. Here's part of the description of Reconsidering Reparations from Haymarket Books website. Quote, a clear new case for reparations as a constructive, future-oriented project that responds to the weight of history's injustices with the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. Centuries ago, Taiwo explains, European powers engineered the systems through which advantages and disadvantages still flow. Colonialism and transatlantic slavery forged schemes of injustice on an unprecedented scale, a world order he calls, quote, global racial empire, end quote. The project of justice must meet the same scope. Taiwo's analysis not only discourages despair, it demands global resistance. Reconsidering reparations suggests policies, goals, and organizing strategies. And it leaves readers with clear and powerful advice. Act like an ancestor. Do what we can to shape the world we want our moral descendants to inherit, and have faith that they will continue the long struggle for justice.
Yeah.
So this book has been amazing so far. I'm really looking forward to finishing it and, of course, talking about it with you next time.
Yeah, me too. I'm just getting into it. I'm a little behind, but the few pages I've read so far are really, really great. And I've really enjoyed all the stuff that we've read by him.
Yes.
A few articles here and there too. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.